Okay, so somebody had a question on Reddit, and I had thoughts on it, and I'm just gonna kind of go over it. I responded already, so I'm more or less going to be using my responses as a bit of a script here. But knowing me, I'll probably go off track a little. Okay, so their question was, hopefully this makes sense, but when you play a piece with both hands, how do you approach it mentally? Do you view it as having two hands each playing their own parts independently, or as a single merged part that requires the left hand, right hand, or both on different beats? Okay, so I'm going to go a little beyond the scope of this slightly, but it's always both hands, okay? Like, it's like walking. You can't practice walking one leg at a time. It just doesn't work that way. Your legs always have to work together. Um, when people try to practice hands separately, they almost always end up coming back and essentially having to start the piece over. You work it up to tempo in each hand, and then you start back over from the beginning, and it's almost as if you were just starting. And I'll get to how to better approach that. Um, but you should have been just practicing the coordination along the way, thinking about the vertical alignment and how subdivision of beats work. You need to be constantly making your brain go through that mental thought process with all of your music all the time. Because you'll never get fluent at being able to do that if you're not constantly introducing yourself to that. Because what happens is you end up memorizing, you're buffering these ideas, and you stop actually needing to think through the process of what that looks like, and it means you just never get good at doing it in real time. um, so you're never playing two things at the same time. A lot of people will think of it as they are playing two different ideas at the same time. That's never the case. You are playing one idea that's using both hands. Even in cases like fugues or Bach conventions, things where you clearly have two different sort of melodic ideas or counterpoint happening against each other, you still need to be thinking about how the whole sounds, and you have to be thinking about the vertical alignment. You still have to be counting and subdividing and not trying to think of two different hands going at different speeds or anything like that. It's always just subdivision of the same beat. So you should always start with both hands, and even if that means that you need to pat the rhythms on your lap, do that. The thing that I tend to tell people to do is to just pat on their lap. I'll kill the sound on my piano. I don't have. Sorry, my piano's not on the screen. I don't have. That's not available. Anyway, pat on your lap. Put a hand on each knee, right? And just pat your rhythms and figure out how to do that. I say that instead of clapping because, for one, clapping, you can only clap one rhythm at a time, and there is arguably a coordination issue with clapping. That's a whole other issue. But just pat the rhythms on your lap if you need to, if that's the starting point. And if you're struggling with that, well, that's also a sign that it's probably beyond where you're at, to start this piece anyway. But you do need to be thinking of your parts as interlocking parts from day one. If you find yourself needing to play something hand separately, it's because you have a technical deficit in one hand or the other. And if that's the case for most of the piece, then that piece is just beyond you. Nobody wants to hear that. They think, oh, I'll try hard enough and I'll work hard enough and I'll get it. You won't. You won't have the mental bandwidth to practice effectively. So you'll waste a lot of time. But you're also just, you'll never be able to play it super well. You'll probably get somewhere, pretty deep into it, and maybe 80%, and you'll just feel like you're beating your head against the wall. Even if you got all of the notes, you probably wouldn't be able to play them consistently start to finish in performance over and over. You wouldn't have the spare mental bandwidth to think of playing things musically, because you would just be focusing so hard on keeping your hands doing things and coordinating that and lining that up, because you're thinking literally like two separate things a lot of times with your hands. So never think of it as two separate things with your hands. The thing that I tell people to do is, if you find that you need to practice something hand separately, and most of it hand separately, shelf that but you can take elements from that piece of music and make them part of your practice routine. Um, just off the top of my head and without my piano to give a demonstration, let's say you were trying to learn a ragtime piece, right? That's a lot going on because you've got syncopated rhythms in your right hand and you've got these huge jumps in your left hand. Okay, go make practicing stride patterns, those big jumps in your left hand, just part of your technical work for weeks at a time. The same way that you would approach scales or arpeggios. If possible, do it in every key, like you would with scales and arpeggios. If possible, and you have the theory knowledge to do it, and if you don't, you should get it, take some of the chord progressions from that rag piece you want to play. Just 2 or 3 chords in a row, you'll find little loops of them. Play those in every key. That will really make it part of your technique, so you don't even have to think about the execution as much. And you can do a lot of similar things with your right hand. You could make that just a counting exercise that you practice. Once again, patting on your lap, you could make that part of your technical work away from the piano, just patting straight beats on your left knee and the syncopated rhythms against your right knee, so that you can not struggle with that in the long term. So I get that people really balk at this idea that you have to start hands together from the start. I really used to argue against people who would say this, because I would think that I thought it was a really gatekeepy way of approaching this, and that is just an issue where, okay, it's easy for them to say because they can already do it. And that is an issue I really take issue with piano teachers in general, because most of the time the issues with piano teachers and why they teach so poorly is because they take their own skills for granted and they don't understand why a student is struggling with it. And as a result, they don't put in the necessary steps and scaffolding to progressively get to a certain point. They just expect, well, it's not hard for me. Why is it hard for this kid? But in this case, like, I was just wrong, okay? Like, I was wrong about you have to play hands separately from the start. I get how hard it is to play hands together from the start, but the person who convinced me I was wrong was Dr. Robert Duke, and you can look him up. He does a lot of music research on these kinds of things. There are things that I worry about methodologically sometimes because you just can't take out all the variables. But overall, I agree with a lot of his research. But I got to have a talk with him after he gave a talk at a music convention. And I don't know, we sort of got onto this topic, and he was just mentioning it casually, talking about starting hands together from the beginning. And I kind of pushed back, and he pushed back on me. And he said more or less, if the music's easy enough, then you can always start hands together. And so let's unpack that for a second. He's not saying this only counts for easy music. He's saying that you should be working on music that is easy enough that you can always play it hands together. And over time, where that line is will move. And so you'll be able to play harder music hands together from the start because that will be easier for you. It starts to fall into what I would call the sweet spot for like efficient learning. You waste so much time when you pick something that is so beyond you and you're fighting to play it and you're doing hands separately a lot and you're doing all these technical hurdles and then you're struggling to put the rhythms together. You could spend weeks or months, and so many people do, they spend months on one piece of music. You could have learned dozens of easier pieces in the same amount of time, and you would have made vastly more progress because you would have been reinforcing those reading concepts every day. You would have been reinforcing different types of rhythm issues, not just in that one piece, but you learn a lot of simple, easier, shorter pieces, and so they all have slightly different rhythm things for you to work through, or slightly different keys, things like that, so that you actually have to work through more variety of material. And it's low-hanging, small small hurdles, short hurdles, and it keeps you working on the things that you need to be working on. But if you're always, stubbornly trying to attack these ridiculously difficult pieces, you're just not going to get that. You're not going to get to work through those problems that you need to work through. And I wasted so much time. And I guess that's probably why I'm really passionate about this. I wasted a lot of time, like early in my career. For those who don't know, I started piano late as an adult. But early in my career, I fought against this. And, part of it, I was just being forced to, just the nature of the work I was doing, to work on music that was well beyond me. But when I would have time to just practice on my own, I would sort of just throw myself at more music that was also too hard for me. And, I'd had, I'd seen so many piano teachers who pushed for this, and I thought, oh, hand separate's the way to go. And I would even advise people at the time, oh, what you do is you work on it hand separately, and you get those things up to tempo, then you half the tempo, and then you put it back together. No, I was giving terrible advice. And I'm glad that I have realized how wrong I was about that. But I'd heard that advice so much and I was following it. But no, after having this conversation with him, I really sort of went back and fixed it, because part of my problem was, I was a degreed musician. Okay. I had been gigging professionally on trumpet for quite some time, probably 10 years at that point. And, I sight read really, really well on trumpet. It's really common, it was then, still is, that I would go to a gig and I would be sight reading live during the performance, because that's just sort of the reading standard for high-level musicians, especially winds and strings. So I was thinking, I'm so good at this, I shouldn't have to lower myself to play, Mary Had a Little Lamb. But I was wrong. I just was wrong. And so once I dropped my ego and I started working through some beginner method books, like, keep in mind, like, this is probably 4 or 5 years into my career. Like, I have been making a living playing piano. And now I'm going, I'm going and working out of these children's method books. I'm going back and filling in these gaps. And then just my growth shot through the roof. Granted, I had slight technical advantages just because I had invested a little into technical work. But I just wasn't, this is what happened. It was the working through, like, the mental skill part of it, the reading in real time, the coordinating and the counting and thinking of everything as interlocking, that really made a difference. Now I get that for people who are absolute beginners, like day one beginners, they have no technical skills at all. Okay. So it's going to be basically impossible for them to find very much music at all that is easy enough to play hands together. They are learning a new language. They're learning to read notes and read the staff. They're learning to read rhythms. They're trying to figure out what to do with their hands. Like, that's a lot. That is just absolutely going to tax and max out your mental bandwidth. Okay. So it's basically impossible for them. But the trap is to feel like and assume that that is just the way it is always going to be, and that every step along the way should be you pushing against these hard pieces, and it should always feel like a struggle. What you actually need to do is, okay, you get past the point where it's that level of struggle, and then you take a step back and you keep working on that really easy music, except now you can always start at hands together. You can start sight reading really simple stuff, hands together. I like to use the example, if you think something's too hard to play hands together from the start, nothing like that exists. If you go look at, like, the first page of Hannah Smith, I wish I had it here right now. It's basically just whole notes, right? It's whole notes in both hands. And they're both hands are playing the same whole note. So literally you could just be playing 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 1, you're counting the whole notes, and you have all that time while you're holding those notes to think, okay, I'm counting, but like what? Okay, so the next finger needs to be 3, and the next finger, okay, and you have that time, but you have to do that. You have to do that ridiculously slow process in your head, but it only comes from reading that kind of stuff. So there is material that's easy enough, but it sucks. Like that's what people don't want to do once they've been playing this baby music for a little while. They want to quickly move ahead to playing stuff that sounds cooler. But I promise you, if you invest in the skills early on when it sucks, you'll just improve so much faster. It's also significantly easier to invest in it at the beginning because a lot of times at the beginning, we're just excited about the process. We're way more excited about the process. Everything is novel and new and exciting, and little tiny bits of progress feel like large achievements when you're a beginner. I've seen so many people talk about that where they're like, oh, I know this isn't a big deal to most people, but like feels amazing to me. Yes, it feels amazing when you first learn something new and you have success with it. So tap into that while you're still a beginner and work on really easy music and get used to feeling what that kind of confidence feels like to like work on something from the start. It's like, oh my God, that first time when you're like, I am playing this hands together from the very first practice session. And then when you're able to read something, you realize I am sight reading this in real time with both hands and I'm not stopping. Those are just amazing milestones to feel. And eventually you'll just, like I said, you'll level up. What's easy for you ascends in difficulty. So I would encourage everybody to make sure you're playing hands together from the start as much as possible. If that means going to easier music, that's exactly what you need to do. And never try to conceptualize it as two hands doing different things or going at different speeds or playing different melodies. It's not. It's just like walking. Your legs are working together. All of your coordination. You don't even think about all of the muscles that are coordinated in your core, things in your inner ear to keep balance. There's so many things that are all working together to make you walk. It's not an issue of you learning one leg at a time. But you might have to do, here we go, off the tracks, but you might have to do things. Walking is a good analogy to piano, again, because just like I said, where you might need to take some technical exercises and go work on them in isolation and then come back and work on that piece later. Just shelve it and come back a month later when it's easier. The technique is kind of ingrained. It's the same thing with walking. If you need to rehabilitate your walking for some reason, you might, a physical therapist might recognize that, oh, you have weakness or muscle atrophy in this leg, or you're having problems with, whatever. And you probably wouldn't work on that by walking and just trying to walk and stumbling all the time. You would probably do rehabilitation, you're doing exercises specifically for that one leg, for its range of motion, for building its muscles back up, because they are the deficit and they need to be worked on before you can effectively get on the parallel bars and try to walk yourself across them. So you just need to learn to work effectively. It'll make your music life so much better. Anyway, that's it.